Good evening and namaskar. Speaker of today's meeting, respected CA Nawshir Mirza, one of our own, is part of the core group of BCA. President of the Institute of Indian Auditors Mumbai chapter, CA Barzin Dubash. Vice President of BCA, CA Sunil Gabawala. Core group member, CA Preeti Cherian. Past presidents, seniors in profession, and my dear friends of BCA and IIA Bombay chapter, and all those watching live on stream. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress, working together is success. So said American clergyman Edward Elbert Hale. BCA and I Bombay chapter came together in January 2017 with the signing of an MOU. In this very room, we celebrated this historic event in the presence of the President and CEO of IINC, Mr. Richard Chambers. The collaboration envisages organizing joint programs, authoring joint publications, sharing of published articles, opening of events other than jointly organized, and permitting members of either party to enroll for programs and to subscribe to journals at discounted member rates. Over the past year or so, certain baby steps have been taken in terms of the MOU. Published articles have been shared, and events organized by one have been open to the other. While efforts have been made to organize joint programs, it is only today that we have set the ball rolling. And in hindsight, it does make us happy to have a distinguished personality such as CA Nawshir Mirza to address the members on a topic that concerns us all, independent directors' role in corporate governance. Our VP elect, Manish Sampath, a dear friend of Mr. Mirza, informed me that Mr. Mirza has come early from his holiday for this lecture. Sir, we are obliged at your commitment. Let me share some thoughts on the topic of today's lecture meeting. India represents a dynamic and diverse combination of small, medium sized, and large companies with over 6,000 listed companies that access capital from domestic and international investors to fund their growth. Moreover, corporate India plays a pivotal role in facilitating nation building, and the presence of a vibrant corporate governance is critical for bolstering India's economic growth. An independent director has been defined as a non executive director on the board of a company, one who has integrity, sense of accountability, track record of achievements, financial literacy, experience, and the independence to balance the interest of various stakeholders. He also has the ability to think strategically with a degree of commitment and sense of devotion. Independent directors play an active role in various committees set up by a company to ensure good governance. Over the last decade, lawmakers in India have been extremely cognizant of the importance of corporate governance, and valuable recommendations from eminent committees have largely been adopted and enforced from time and again. However, corporate governance practices, even in the most reputed listed Indian companies, have been questionable on several dimensions and occasions, which steers the demand for a high quality level of corporate governance. The Kotak Committee on Corporate Governance was constituted in June 17 under the chairmanship of Mr. Uday Kotak. Its primary objective was improving standards concerning corporate governance of listed companies in India. The committee was represented by different stakeholders and was requested to provide recommendations on diverse issues such as ensuring independence in the spirit of independent directors and their active participation in the functioning of the company and other areas as defined in its scope. The committee submitted its report detailing several recommendations in October 17. SEBI in March 18 took important decisions on the recommendation of the committee. SEBI also decided to accept several recommendations of the committee without any modifications. The recommendations advanced by the committee and approved by the SEBI do a commendable job in coping up with the ever-changing global trends and market demands with regard to corporate governance. It's a forward leap in realizing transparent and sound corporate governance. Considering the recent and alarming corporate frauds and banking scams, SEBI's sanction to the committee recommendation would in all likelihood make the contemporary corporate scenario more transparent, accountable, and sustainable. Given this scenario, we found it essential to hold a lecture meeting on the subject of corporate governance role of independent directors. Before the learned speaker takes over, may I request Mr. Bajin Dubash to introduce the guest speaker to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pansari, and good evening to everybody. Uh, you know, on the NSE, there are a little more than 1,700 listed companies, and there are about a little less than 11,000 directors who sit on these boards, of which about 5,500 are independent. Of those, about 912 are women, and there are, perhaps uh, 184 of those 1,700, companies who have more than five directors. The others have less. 51, companies uh, as of last week did not have a woman director as yet. So I think that one of the uh, issues on the whole role of the independent director is also, are there enough independent directors, and are they the right quality? If one were to do a age analysis of the individuals who play the roles of independent directors, almost 44% of those individuals have ages 60 and above. There are some who are as old as 90 who still serve on these boards. And there are only about 100 who are less than 35. So out of the 5,000 odd independent directors, is very skewed towards folks who perhaps have a lot more experience. And one of the issues that I think we need to answer is the role of independent director, sort of coterminous with the amount of experience that person has, or is there merit in some younger blood also come on these boards? So with that, uh, I guess that Mr. Mirza doesn't need too much of introduction, save for the fact that he currently serves as the independent director on several boards, notably on Exide Industries, on Tata Power, on Thermax, and is also active at the Center of Advancement of Philanthropy. Mr. Mirza has been involved in this whole sort of movement for improved governance for the last 15 years. Before which, as a matter of pride, he was my boss. So, so in that context, it is it is always a pleasure to stand here and introduce Mr. Mirza. Apart from being a speaker at many conferences on the theme of corporate governance, uh, Mr. Mirza has been described by an article in the Economic Times as a tall, no nonsense, but humorous independent director. I will add the words wise and principled, to those qualities. And I'm sure it's with those qualities that he will, provide us with his comments this evening on the role of the independent director. So with that, Mr. Mirza. Thank
So we are ahead of time. That's good. Where is your full screen? You know? हम्म, नहीं नहीं हाँ आ गया चल so Narayan, Burzin, Sunil, and my other friends, thank you for being here today to listen to me. Thank you also to the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society and the Institute of Internal Auditors, both of which I have the honor to have the membership of, to have invited me today to share my own ideas on this topic. And as you can see, the title is a little different from what is gone out in the program. And I'll tell you, when I was asked to come and talk to you, uh, it's been some years since I had any interest in sections and clauses and the LODR and the Companies Act 13. So I'm not going to talk to you about all the legal stuff, because that you people are the experts, and I would be challenged being able to speak to you on a topic of which you are the experts, not me. So what I thought is, I'd rather talk about something a little different, related to the topic, but approach it from a different point of view. Now, as you know, recently independent directors have been somewhat in the spotlight along with auditors, independent auditors, and both of it haven't come out too well. Both of them haven't come out too well in the when they have been exposed to the spotlight. What are the recent things you have seen happening with independent directors? As you know, maybe it didn't start then, but if I go back and I say the first big issue happened when the Tata Group had all this mess 2 years ago. And as you may also remember, the only little involvement somehow in that whole group of so many companies and maybe 100 independent directors on the different more prominent company boards was, there was a little peep from the Indian Hotels Board. Deepak Parekh led a little bit of thing. You heard something once. After that, the whole thing was snuffed out. The independent directors didn't seem to take any position when that unfortunate event happened. Then, as you know, this happened in the infamous Infosys situation about a year later, when again a former head of the group, as a shareholder, influenced a major change in management, and the independent directors were left helpless. That was the second time this happened. More recently, of course, after the this insolvency and the banking code, there have been two instances about 6 months ago. You may have read about this. So that's to talk you out of wanting to become an independent director. As your husband said, go there and listen to Nawshir. He'll tell you why you shouldn't be. But one, if you remember, two builders in Delhi, Unitech and JP. Well, JP not a builder, but this was in his role as a builder. Uh, about 6 months ago, the courts took away the passports and froze the bank accounts of all the independent directors. Till each of those companies came up with, I think, 2,000 crores. But as you can see, with Sahara, it has been taken forever to get them to cough up the money. So I don't know if those people have got back their bank accounts or their passports. But right now, if they haven't, the poor independent directors are having a challenge. You know that recently the CBI has gone after the IDBI independent directors, I think three of them, alleging that they were not vigilant enough when loans were given to that SL Maxis situation. So independent directors have been in the spotlight and have not come out too well from it. And so I thought I will talk about why independent directors do not perform well, because society and the world at large has a lot of expectations from these creatures. 18 years ago, the then clause 49 mandated the introduction of independent directors. That's how I first became an independent director at that time. So after that, there has been a lot of disquiet and distress at what independent directors have done, what the expectations of society are, and what the actual delivery has been. And why is this so? Because, I think either Narayan or Burzin said something about qualified independent directors, and I agree, having all the right attributes. So, why, with all of those attributes, because many of these independent directors have good attributes. I mean, Nitin Gadkari appointed his car driver as an independent director in his family companies, but let's leave that aside. I'm not talking of car drivers and peons, or even people making their spouses independent directors who haven't the right qualification. Leave all those people aside. The fact is, why have even eminent individuals failed as independent directors? Indeed, in the Satyam case, there were very eminent people who were independent on that board, and they didn't succeed either. So, what is the reason for their failure? So, I thought I would like to talk to you and share with you my analysis of the problem. I could well be wrong, and I would welcome your challenge or your interest in what I'm saying as we go forward. But let me scroll right back and let me go back all the way to here. It says 1962. And this is not the only time Milton Friedman expressed such a view. Milton Friedman was a Nobel laureate and eminent economist of that era. And you can read what he said in this particular essay. And I said he wrote books, he gave speeches, all of which essentially said the same thing. Few trends could so thoroughly undermine the foundations of our free society as the acceptance by corporate officials, that means executives, directors, so on, of a social responsibility, other than to maximize money making. That's essentially what he said. And that is the one single motto that is taught to everybody who goes to MBA school. The one thing they are taught is how can you maximize the amount of money by one way or the other. Proper ways. I'm not saying that they teach you improper ways, but essentially the whole objective that Milton Friedman laid out as the role of companies is to maximize money making for their shareholders. That's what he said, and that's been the belief even till now. I have not heard in business schools a substantially different approach to the purpose of a company than what Friedman said at that time. And as you know, all business schools were modeled around the American business schools. And since this man had such a powerful influence on American business, that's permeated right down the system into every business school anywhere in the world. And all these people who come out of those machines come here and essentially practice what Friedman 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, wrote. But water has flown under the bridge. There's been a lot of criticism of the corporate sector, of its role, of what it's done to society. So let's look at two different views on this. A former chairman of Canon, this is what, you know, the Japanese are sort of all sensitive and that sort of thing. So he wrote, if corporations run their businesses with the sole aim of gaining more market share or earning more profit, exactly what Friedman suggested, they may well lead the world into economic, environmental, and social ruin. And if we look around, to some extent, that is true, or to a substantial extent, that is true. Just yesterday, we had this World Environment Day, and the theme of this Environment Day was plastic. Next year, it'll be something else. It's all part of the system to, keep throwing, making platitudinous statements while you merrily continue to do what you shouldn't be doing. So this is what he said: earning more profit, market share may lead into economic ruin, environmental ruin, and social ruin. But if they work together in a spirit of kyoisei, Japanese word, don't worry about it, they can bring food to the poor, peace to the war-torn areas, and renewal to the natural world. It is our obligation as business leaders to join together to build a foundation for world peace and prosperity. So this is something he wrote, and he was the chairman of a big international company called Canon. Let's look at what a man closer to our own country wrote. J.R.D. Tata, almost at the end of his life, I think after he wrote this in the introduction to a book, he died after a few months. He said, I believe that the social responsibilities of our enterprises, and as you know, the Tata Group in J.R.D.'s time took on social responsibility as a major role for that group. And so he was, in fact, the man who drove the group towards taking on greater social responsibility. We now see only the momentum of his drive that we still see in the group, but essentially it is he who got that engine moving with great power. I believe that the social responsibilities of our enterprises should now extend even beyond serving people to the environment, not only to humans, but also to the land, the forests, the waters, and the creatures that inhabit them. So you can see that in those last 60 years when Friedman propounded the view that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value. That's what he said. And I retired many years ago, a little prematurely, and I used to say that I retired because I was fed up of hearing this thing about maximizing shareholder value. So everybody was expected to do it, including auditors. So, so I said, now this has become too much, and I just can't take this anymore, maximizing shareholder value. So I retired. I mean, that's not the only reason I retired, but I retired. And so you can see JRD and the different views, and there are many people who have now spoken in this same vein. These are not the only two individuals. How much of this is practiced, you may still have a doubt about, and I'll tell you what the reason for that is. That is where I'm moving ahead, the theme of my thing. But before that, let me just beg your forgiveness to quote something from the Companies Act, having said right in the beginning that I shall refrain from, or not refrain from, I shall not have the courage to talk about it. But what I've said here is, and I must say to the credit of our country, this is the first country in the world which has laid out this kind of obligation on companies. I have not seen any country anywhere in the world. And what is this obligation? One is a section, the rest of it is strangely put into the responsibilities of independent directors, the fourth schedule to the Act. But look at first the section. Directors shall act in good faith in order to promote the objects of the company. That's all for given for the benefit of its members, which is what we have always understood. And in the best interests of the company, we've also always understood that. It goes on to say, and its employees. For why it says shareholders again, only the drafters of this badly drafted law can explain, having already said members. But then it says the community and the protection of the environment. So while many countries in the world have put obligations on that, they have not said that is at the heart of a company's purpose. They have essentially said this: the directors of a company shall act in the interests of the community and the environment. Look at the fourth schedule. Now, this puts all the burden on independent directors, but indirectly, it's nothing but the burden on all directors or the whole company. It says, independent directors shall safeguard the interests of all stakeholders. So it introduces a new word, not shareholders, not members. It talks of stakeholders. You all understand what a stakeholder is, so I will not take your time. Safeguard the interests of all stakeholders, and then it says minority shareholders. The next clause is I think, at the heart of the whole thing. Independent directors shall, and they can't do it themselves. Essentially, what it says, a company shall balance the conflicting interests of all the stakeholders. Now, this is a profound statement if you reflect upon it. It's just a very, very short sentence, but it's profound. First, it talks about balancing. So, it does not make the shareholder preeminent. Till now, we always believed the shareholder is preeminent, everyone else is secondary. And so long as it's not in the shareholder's disinterest or it does not hurt the shareholder, you must also recognize the other stakeholders. No longer. It says every stakeholder is equal. Shareholder, employee, customer, the environment, vendors, providers of goods and services, they are all now put on a level. So it says balance. Then it talks about interests. Now again, think of that word. You people are greater experts because half of you must be practicing tax, so you know all of how to interpret a word. But interest is not the same thing as rights. See, the rights are laid down in laws. The interests are not laid down in laws. The interests are well beyond a person's rights. So, Sterlite may claim that we are not putting any poison into the river, but or if we are putting any poison, it's within the framework of the pollution laws. And so, we are respecting the rights of the villagers who live downstream from this. But the interests of those may be well beyond their legal rights. And if the legal right is you shouldn't put more than 1 milligram in every 1,000 liters of water or whatever the thing is. That's not the point. The villagers think they are being harmed even with that 1 milligram in 1,000 liters or whatever is the particular standard the law has determined. And so their interests are nevertheless being harmed. And so the law already says, shall balance the conflicting interests. So reflect on that word. And lastly, it talks of stakeholders. So, and in fact, it presupposes a conflict in those interests. So it is, the business people like to say, no, this is a win-win situation and all this. There are many situations which are not win-win. I'll tell you an amusing story, which is not, it's a true story. I used to, many years ago when I lived in Calcutta, we used to have a client that had a paper mill, a very large paper mill, and they used to put their effluent into the Mahanadi. And the Hirakud Dam, which I don't know if any of you have seen, is a massive structure. And whatever they put into the river was causing the dam to develop cracks. And so naturally, in the local Tehsildar's court, some action was brought against this particular paper mill. And so what did the paper mill do? They produced a villager who lived downstream of where this effluent was being dumped into the river. And they said to the judge, that I don't know what the right term is, but I'm taking some Hindi movie liberty. So, Your Honor, here is a flask full of our effluent, drawn exactly where the drain is falling into the river. And now, Your Honor, in front of you, this villager is going to drink this whole glass of effluent. And so the poor man, who must have been paid whatever he was paid, drank the whole glass of effluent. Obviously, he didn't die immediately. And so the case was dismissed. So these are the kind of things which people have resorted to get their ways around rules that have been made. Never mind the interests, even the rights were perhaps being trampled where this poor villager was made to drink this thing. And then there's another clause which goes on further and talks about employees and so on and so forth. And then, of course, they brought in the section 135, the 2% CSR rule. So I think ours is the first companies act in the world that has put stakeholder interests at the heart of corporate purpose. The kind of things which were said by JRD and some of the others earlier. Now, conventionally, what do boards do? There are 4 things they broadly do. You can make a dhobi list of 50 items, but essentially there are 4 things. If you go to MBA school, they'll say the whole purpose of the board is to do strategy. So it is. So they do strategy. Strategy means sort of medium to long term, where this company ought to be going. Transactions. So should we do an acquisition? Should we divest something? Should we do a major deal? So there are transactions which boards are required to approve, whether legally or by their own internal corporate delegation of powers. There are soft issues nowadays. So culture, ethics, all that sort of thing is brought to the board. It's so soft, it's amorphous. And so, the boards have a session on this. What really is achieved from those sessions, I have yet to discover. But they do that, soft issues. And lastly, there are statutory things which say under the law, something has to be approved by a board, or the bank will say you want to open an account, you must get a board resolution. So there are essentially 4 things boards have conventionally done or ought to be doing. Whether they're doing it is another matter. But into all of these is woven now the stakeholder issue. So if you're developing a strategy, your strategy you have to develop bearing in mind a balance between the interests of all the people who are stakeholders in your company. Now, as accountants, we all understand that balance requires a common unit of measurement. Otherwise, how do you prove there is balance? So everything has to be measured either in rupees or in kilograms or in feet or some common unit of measurement. So how do you measure the interests of different stakeholders in a common unit of measurement? It's very difficult. So we haven't yet invented this thing. I remember many years ago, not many years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, speaking to a whole room full of academicians in the corporate sector in Amsterdam. So it was a world conference. And I asked, you people are the people who can develop these processes, because this is exactly in the domain of academia, where they love to sit and think. So what kind of system shall we develop where we can measure in a common unit of measurement the impact of a company's operations on the interests of different stakeholders? And there was glum silence in the room because nobody had actually even thought about addressing it. And these were some of the leading corporate academicians of the world. So the first challenge we have is we can't establish we have balance. So there are various things a company can do, and the purpose of my talk today is not to take you through those. That's another issue altogether. So why then are companies and directors and independent directors failing in this particular respect, as well as failing in even the more conventional things? All the problems I mentioned earlier, the IBC or the Tata Infi Group, all of those, there's nothing to do with stakeholders. It's just things are happening in companies where the independent directors seem to be completely standing on the sidelines watching a game being played with no role whatsoever, apparently, in big issues. They may have their roles in the more routine things, but why are they on the sidelines when really they have to stand up and be counted? So what are the influences on boardroom behavior? There are essentially three influences on boardroom behavior. The first is the very powerful, impossible to challenge influence of the capitalist system. And corporations are nothing but creatures or the main engines of the capitalist system. They are. And the capitalist system makes sure that nothing will happen that will in any way undermine the preeminence of the provider of capital. That is what the capitalist system is. That everything exists to maximize, as Friedman propounded, or not even propounded, but I think he articulated it, to maximize the returns to the provider of capital. That is the whole purpose of the capitalist system. So this system is not going to ever be defeated. And people tried. They tried to invent new systems. They had them in Russia, in China, various other countries. Though all the alternative systems have failed, they have not worked. So there is no alternative that has come up. So you have to live with this system. And therefore, the whole institution of independent directors was set up in the futile hope, I would say, that somehow these individuals would curb the power of the capitalist system and get corporations to behave in a somewhat slightly different manner from how they had been behaving. The second is human psychology. And any one of you who has sat in a group and discussed things in a group will see that psychology plays a huge role in how you as a group perform. So each of us may have some idea in our minds. Most of the times we suppress that idea and we do not express it. Unless we sense that the group is all in agreement, then of course we are very, very, very happy to put forward our idea because everyone else has already cheered it. So human psychology is a major element in boardroom behavior. And lastly, for us as Indians, and apart from the fact that we in India have business families and many old societies have companies that are owned by business families, it's not unique to us. Even in America, there's large numbers of companies which are owned by business families. They're not all Coca-Cola and McDonald's and corporations like that. So large numbers. But Indian culture has its own unique features, and the whole structure of companies, executives, boards, so on and so forth, has not been designed in India. It's been designed in a different, what I would call a Judeo-Christian social environment, where a certain norm of behavior is expected and accepted. Many of those norms of behavior are not expected and accepted in our own country. So, whilst in an identical situation, maybe a board in America may behave in a certain manner as was conceived of that particular whole structure of a corporation, in India it may behave differently. So let me go back one second. And what is unique? I'm no sociologist, so I'm just an independent director. And just if I look around, and I had the opportunity in years past to look at how boards overseas perform, and if I just, or not necessarily boards, even groups of people, how how they interact, how they talk to each other, how they share ideas, I could identify a few things where we are different from others. For many years, I used to not believe this, that Indians are different. But as I've got older and older, I tend to believe that more and more. Let me give you the first example. We're a highly individualistic people. And each of us thinks he has the solution, or he thinks the way to achieve a certain goal. And each will want to do it his way. For many years, before Burzin started to be part of my group, I tried for many years in my then firm where I was to get them to adopt an audit methodology. But it was like, there's a phrase called herding cats. It was like trying to herd cats, because every auditor in that group, some 600-700 of them, thought he has the right way to do the audit. And you can keep giving them training, you can keep giving them manuals, you can keep giving them speeches, you can keep sending them back and say, do it again. But they still would do it their way. And it was not that they all 600 had a way which was different from the firm's way. All 600 had a different way. So there were 601 ways. The firm's way plus 600. We are highly individualistic. If you just go on the street and see how we drive. Have you ever seen a country or in the world where they drive like we do in India? For many years, somehow because of the past momentum, we used to observe you must drive on the left. This is no longer true. Yeah, even big cars I have seen driving on Marine Drive on the wrong side. So we're a highly individualistic people. It's got many advantages to being that. I'm not being critical. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I've always believed our IT sector has excelled itself because of our highly individualistic nature, not working in a team. Take why we excel at cricket, because cricket is essentially one man versus one man. The fielders are only there to stop the ball, but it's really the bowler versus the batsman. It's an individual game. There is no in cricket. It's not a matter of you must surrender something for the ultimate benefit of the team. So if you play football or hockey or any of those games, when you receive the ball, you pass it on to the guy who is likely to score, but not us, because every time I get the ball, I want to score. Even if I'm right 100 yards from the goal, I want to score. I won't pass it on to my colleague who is better positioned. So that's why we're not good at those games. We're excellent at cricket, which is a one versus one game. It is. Or take, we're unable to disagree openly. We can neither receive dissent nor are we able to give dissent. If anyone disagrees with me, I take it very personally. It's almost as if, he's insulting me. And they're also insulting me in public. There are 10 directors sitting in the room, there's a company secretary, some others, and he disagrees with me. So I receive it badly, and therefore, the person who is disagreeing is reluctant to disagree, because it almost becomes like a personal issue between these individuals. And I've seen this many times in boards where people will outside the boardroom or whisper to you, say this, I don't agree. They will not. We're unable as a people to receive or give disagreement or dissent, genuine dissent. Then we have this thing about respect for elders. Now, it's a good thing to be respecting of elders, but it also sometimes snuffs out the ability to challenge your elder. Now, if you are in an American home then at the breakfast table, the son will disagree with his father. It's unheard of in India, not even at the dinner table, never mind breakfast. They cannot disagree. And often the father may be wrong, but you must touch his feet. Till my mother passed away, my dear mother, she used to always grumble that your brother touches my feet, you never touch them. I said, no, I don't believe in this feet touching. It's. I respect you. I interact with you well. That's what is expected of me. By touching your feet, it's not going to make a difference. But this is our social behavior. So when the chairman Babuji has a view, how many younger directors are going to disagree with Babuji or Lalaji or any other Ji? It's a fact. I put it humorously, but this is the reality. As a people, now when they develop corporations and they said there should be boards and there should be directors, those who develop these believe that there will be good dissent, there will be argument, and there will be eventually a solution reached. But in India, we have other hurdles to that kind of interaction. Then it's a word I've heard as I've got older: adjust, accommodate. What does adjust and accommodate mean? That you are right, but ab jane do. Don't make a big fuss about it. Manage karo, manage. Yes, that's a good word. Manage karo. All of these are not conducive to good boardroom decision making. So there are several, and I'm sure there's another 10 things which are where we are different from the others. But all of these are not conducive to reaching a good decision in the boardroom. And it's been my sorry experience, because as you can see, I'm the kind of person who is a little direct in the way he expresses himself and doesn't hesitate to. So it's my sorry experience that many of my colleagues think I'm a bit of a pain in the, not a bit, they think I'm a very big pain in their anatomy. So it's not easy. So what is the impact of all of these three major things? First is on protecting the interests of stakeholders other than the controlling shareholder. There is a controlling shareholder. All may not be business families, but there's always a controlling shareholder. And how do you protect the interests of the other stakeholders when you are under an influence which says the controlling shareholder is sitting in the chair, he has achieved a certain stature and a position, he has lots of money, so he must have been something great about him. How can we disagree with this individual, woman or man? So we must suppress our views, because when he speaks with success behind him. What are you? You're just an independent director he was kind enough to bring onto the board. So maybe you will sort of obliquely sort of try and convey a certain view, but we are not sensitive enough to pick up oblique suggestions. So those oblique suggestions just bounce off and go on the wayside. Wrong decisions are reached. And certainly very difficult to get stakeholders' interests on the boardroom table. If you come up with such an idea that should we think of the environment, sort of kindly, everybody will say, that's a good idea. Okay, we will keep it in mind. But then we'll do exactly what we've always done. Yeah. So there is a hesitation for anybody then to even speak about these things. Then there is this thing about always directors should add value. But the measure of value is what can they do to make the company more profitable? That's the only measure of value. Can you get us a contract? Can you get us to go and meet the minister or get us some other deal? Or can you facilitate some particular problem, solving of a particular problem? This is what value addition is. As I said earlier, challenging the controlling shareholder and the management, we are not good at. We don't normally challenge. Very, very, very rare, I can say, where a challenge is made. to the controlling shareholder and the management. Then there's the challenge of groupthink, which is very common. That if a couple of people in the room express a certain view, almost everybody tends to think that is the right view. And they do not step back, apply their own minds, and question those decisions. Take this whole case of so many companies are over indebted today. All those fellows who are in the bankruptcy and insolvency courts, and every day you read about Binani and various other people who are in those problems. I used to do the audit of Binani at one time. But anyway, so what essentially has been the problem there in all of these companies? They overtraded. They all thought they will get money from banks. Maybe they will service their debt, but it will help them to grow fast, to become the biggest. The biggest is a big thing in capitalism. Is yours the biggest? Your company, I mean. Is it the biggest? So often, some people with dirty minds are snickering at my intended comment. So it is a big thing in the capitalist system. So how does Mr. J.P. Gore become the biggest? He doesn't have such a lot of money to become the biggest in electricity, in cement, in property development, and God knows what else Mr. J.P. Gore has got into. So he borrows money and borrows and borrows and borrows. And for a few years, he may be the biggest. But then he shrinks dramatically and goes limp. So the question really is that what were the independent directors in those companies doing? They were being presented with proposals by management, no doubt, initiated or supported or recommended by the controlling shareholders, suggesting that let's do this project. And the IRR will be 20%. Let's do this one. The payback is only 3 years. Let's do that. Let's do something else. So, and how will we do that? Let's borrow more. So you keep raising the leverage. And there are different devices to raise the leverage. The independent directors either swallowed all of this, hook, line, and sinker, without thinking or applying their minds, or even if some of them had doubts, they kept their doubts to themselves or expressed them in the corridors or when going to the toilet. They didn't express them in the boardroom and vote against those decisions. Did they dissent that we should stop growing? Stop growing? It's a suggestion which, if you make in a company, people will send you away to the lunatic asylum. So, you cannot express dissent when growth is on the agenda. But that was what was necessary in all of these companies. And they have destroyed enormous value by believing their own fictitious projections and plans. Because anyone who knows Excel can make a very nice projection and plan. The reality is a little different. So, challenging these people. Groupthink, sorry. So groupthink, because as I said, then if the chairman and the managing director say it's a great idea, then everybody says, yes, they must have thought about it. Hoga hi, good idea. So let's agree. They may make some remarks on some side issue. That, are you sure? I mean, how did you conclude that growth will be 29% per annum? Oh, we have done our market study and we are confident it will be that. There is no competition, nothing. Okay, theek hai, chalo, I got an answer. How sensible that answer was, nobody really challenges. Giving and receiving disagreement, excuse me, I already did it. And the last thing, I think the last thing that a director is expected to bring is wisdom. And why do I say that? First of all, the hierarchy of knowledge, they say data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. There are sort of 4 levels of knowledge. And your senior management is expected to have knowledge of the business. The MD, the CFO should know all about finance, and the company secretary should know about company law, and the CFO should know about tax. Or if he doesn't, he should go to experts, some sitting in this room, and take that advice. It is not the job of the independent director to constantly second guess the CFO and say there is an easier way to raise this finance, or to suggest that this may be a solution to the tax problem. That may be purely incidental. The idea is not to have a director who is second guessing executive management, because often the wrong idea is given, according to me, that a board should consist of somebody who is an expert in the technology of the business, somebody who is an expert in finance, there should be a lawyer. The idea being that all these people will then fill the gaps in the executive team's competence. If the executive team is not competent, the solution is to chuck them out and get somebody who is. The solution is not to have outside directors coming in once in 3 months and second guessing the executive team. So I believe it's wrong. I believe what outside directors should bring is wisdom. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is essentially having substantial amount of experience mixed with knowledge, and to be able therefore to look into the future and help the company think that if we do this, this is what might happen. That is wisdom. And so Burzin said there is only so many who are less than 35 years old as directors. He was quoting. The fact is, I'm not saying that old people are necessarily wise. You can see me, I am an exception to that statement. But I'm sure, and it's not even to say that young people are not wise. But the probability of a young person being wise, not having had sufficient experience of life, is less. And the probability that an old person is wise is proportionately the greater. That's not a necessary thing. But indeed, on the board, you want wise people, because when I said, the purpose of the board is strategy is essentially looking well into the future. And if you lack wisdom, you cannot look well into the future, because all you will do is to develop a spreadsheet model. And spreadsheet models, you can make perfect, and you can model a spreadsheet for 100 years. But that's not wisdom. The wisdom is to look at that and think, what are the other things that could go right or could go wrong? So let me conclude now, and because then there's some time for question and answer. So let me ask in a rhetorical fashion, and indeed go forward and answer my own questions. Do Indian independent directors, I emphasize Indian because we're now in the Indian context, adequately challenge management and the controlling shareholder? I think here I more or less answered this question as I spoke, and I think very rarely do they challenge management and the controlling shareholder. Very rarely. Challenge on a substantial issue, not on minor issues. That's not the point. And by challenge, I mean not suggesting something, but saying, I disagree and you shouldn't be doing this. I think it's wrong. I think, Mr. Gore, you shouldn't borrow anymore. Let's stop growing. Let's get some cash into the company. Let's pause for 3 or 4 years, 5 years. No heavens will fall. We are going to be here 100 years more. What's your hurry? Because end of the day, there's only one test of success, which is survival. The test of success is not how big you are, but whether you survived. And so how many of those directors told, not necessarily I am picking on poor man Mr. Gore, it's not fair of me, but I'm just giving as an example. And so I don't necessarily blame the promoters, I blame also the outside directors who should have, at a certain point, refused to budge and said, we cannot allow this. Because if they allowed it, it's no good saying it was a collective decision and all of that, because collectively you failed. Do Indian directors be the voice of those stakeholders who are not in the room? Because there's only one stakeholder in the room. That's the controlling shareholder. And he has got a megaphone, so his voice is very loud. It drowns out every other sound. So, what about all the other stakeholders who now the law expects to be recognized, and respected. And it is for the independent directors to speak for them. Obviously, the controlling shareholder is not going to speak for them, he's going to speak for himself, and rightly so. There's nothing wrong in that. It is for the independent directors to express themselves on the other stakeholders who are not in the room. Do they bring wisdom to their decisions? I think sometimes they do, sometimes they may not. So that depends on director to director and situation to situation. But even having looked at a thing and having the wisdom to maybe disagree with it, they do not then express that disagreement. So all that wisdom remains with them, all that idea remains with them, no advantage is gained by the organization. Do they demonstrate independence? I think so. I think most, at least I've not seen independent directors who do not demonstrate independence, or maybe a few don't, but the majority do think independently. What I mean by demonstrate independence, but they may not express that view because of the many reasons we already touched upon. Do they possess integrity? And what do I mean by integrity? I don't mean that do they fiddle with the company's funds. What I mean is, do they say what they think, and do they practice what they profess? So there is a triangle between your thoughts, your words, and your deeds. And is that triangle complete, or are there lots of hypocrites? And that many of us are. And this is not necessarily just Indians. I'm saying around the world, there are many people who will say something for public consumption but be behaving completely differently, and who will say things which they themselves don't believe. So it's not, there is no triangulation between their thoughts, their words, and their behavior. And finally, do they have courage? I think Churchill said that the greatest of all virtues is courage. Why? Because it's the one virtue that ensures that the other virtues are protected. Because if you don't have courage, if you're afraid of what will happen to you if you disagree with the Prime Minister, no other virtue will be protected. So every virtue can be only protected if you have the courage to stand up regardless of the consequences sometimes. So what's the worst? At least in a company, they don't kill you or throw you into jail or even send the income tax inspectors after you. At the worst, they will chuck you out from the board. It's not such a terrible thing to happen, particularly in a company which is the sort which will chuck you out from its board because you are doing the right thing. It's the best thing that could happen to you. So if you haven't got the good sense to leave such a board, it's good that then they do it for you. So do they have the courage? Very few people have courage. Because courage means you shouldn't have too much imagination. If you have imagination, then you get afraid. That's why they give rum to soldiers when they tell them to attack the enemy, because the rum dulls their imagination. It's a fact. Why do they give rum when they tell the man that the chance that you will die is 30%? Which man would go? Would any of you go? But if you've had a couple of tots of rum, that 30% may dwindle to 3%. And you may, in the impression that there's glory involved, risk your life. So you mustn't have too much imagination, or you must curb your imagination if you want to have courage. And if you, in the boardroom, you want to express and to have a conjunction between what you believe and what you're saying. But if you start thinking that, oh, if I do this, then what will the chairman say? What will my colleagues say? Will they reduce my commission this year? If you start thinking of all of those things, your courage has been lost. So, friends, this is as I said, this is the summary page. So I think that there are things in which we are good, things in which we are bad. Around the world, this is the same. There may be some things which in a particular situation hamper us because of our own Indian culture and behaviors. It may hamper us from being a more successful director because of our own culture and behavior. But many of these are common throughout the world. Many people suffer from the same problems that others do. And that is why when we look at corporate problems and people ask, where were the independent directors, or were the independent directors really independent? I have tried to answer in my own amateurish, ham handed manner why sometimes they are and many times they are not. So, with that, thank you. Now, questions.
Wait for the mic. Don't hurry. You are still independent.
Hello. Sir, two issues. There is no end to the non-performance by independent directors. The latest is the board of directors of ICICI Bank.
Yes, another example.
And sir, I understand that in many companies, because of secrecy reasons, the agenda papers are circulated when the board has assembled. So if the board has, particularly independent directors have not gone through, if the agenda papers are not made available 1 week before, or if the accounts are signed just if minutes before the board is assembled, where is the time for the directors to go through the accounts and form a view? So whether these are not wrong practice?
I'll see. Your first was a statement about ICICI Bank. I have nothing to say on that. Another example of how independent directors, according to this, have not been successful. But on the second one, this used to be so, but now, as you know, which is that company secretary standard, which says at least 7 days in advance, unless the board resolves that certain items can be circulated less than 7 days in advance, and almost always it's accounts, and sometimes it may be some other matters. So almost invariably it's accounts, and it's for the board then to say at least 48 hours before we must receive. So at least in all the boards I am, the accounts have to be circulated at least 48 hours before. And I say 48 hours, not 2 days, because if you say 2 days, then in the Companies Act they had clear days and also we're not going to that extent. But what we mean is at least 48 hours before the start of the audit committee meeting or the board meeting, the accounts should go. Then you have enough time. You can't ask for it 7 days in advance because it's true, there's confidentiality involved. Price sensitive, correct. Price sensitive information, quite right. So that.
So I have a question over here. So in the past few weeks, we have seen a spate of resignations by audit firms. Yes, of listed companies. How could an independent auditor, or what role could an independent auditor play in averting, should I say, a disaster? Because it's just one day before the press release, the audit firm resigns. What role could an independent auditor play in averting? Independent director. Independent director play in averting resignation or convince or in providing information to the auditor, the required information to the auditor. What is the role of an independent director in such a case?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, if the auditors are resigning, the independent directors perhaps should also be resigning from those boards in some concern. Yeah. So I'm surprised that audit committee chairman. Indeed, there is I think 2011. There is, I don't know if it's still there, a company called Pyramid Saimara or something. Yeah. They went through all sorts of SEBI ulta pulta. They did many things. And I remember reading many years ago the judgment of SEBI that not only are the independent directors responsible for reliable financial statements and good control systems in the organization, but indeed it went further and said if you have special qualifications or experience, which means essentially if you're an accountant, you are especially liable. So maybe if you've got an engineer on the audit committee, he can feign some amount of ignorance of something complex. But if as an accountant you have been deceived or you have chosen to be deceived, then you are even more liable. So therefore, coming back to your question, I think there are two things. It's always been said. The audit committee should own the relationship with the auditor. What is the meaning of own the relationship? The meaning of own the relationship is the auditor should be obliged to the audit committee for his appointment, his remuneration, and his continuance. He should not be obliged to the controlling shareholder. He should not be obliged to the management. So what are some of the things the audit committee can say? You cannot even discuss with the auditor any other work. You are not allowed. If you want to upon the auditor, maybe to do some due diligence of a entity, talk to the chairman of the audit committee, CFO, talk to the chairman and say, we want to appoint this firm who are our auditors. The chairman of the audit committee will say, there are 1,000 other firms. Can't you go to any of those? Why only this firm? If he's convinced, then he will say, okay, I will talk to the auditor and take this proposal forward, so that the auditor remains in a manner obliged to the audit committee, not to the CFO or the MD or Babuji. So this is not foolproof, but this is the best you can do. And indeed, your question about providing him the information, it's the job of the audit committee to show that in no way is the auditor's role constrained by provision, information not being provided. If they have not done that, then they have also failed in their role.
So, sir, by virtue of these resignations, listed companies, the chairman of the audit committee is an independent director by virtue of the regulations. So, by virtue of this resignations taking place, is the chairman of the audit committee also responsible to the stakeholders for, let's say, a drop in the market capitalization? Of a, okay,
well, that I'll leave to the courts to decide. Then I'll leave to the courts to decide.
Okay, so, okay.
But he is responsible if the auditor,
yeah.
And he would then need to demonstrate, if this matter ever went to court, that he did everything that a reasonable chairman of an audit committee could have done. And in spite of that, the auditor was not satisfied by whatever the particular issue was. But if he can't demonstrate that, then he has not discharged his responsibility. And I think the rest of the committee also, not only the chairman, it's the committee's job. You can't make the chairman responsible, because I chair several audit committees, so I better be clear about.
Thank you, sir.
So the way the independent directors are appointed, as I understand, those are appointed by the controlling shareholder.
Always.
So how can they be independent?
Correct. The question you ask is asked at every corporate governance meeting. See, this is the problem of how else should independent directors be chosen. Many ideas have been propounded. The government should appoint the independent directors. But you know what will happen then? So various suggestions have come. The fact is, in the capitalist system, and since no other alternative has yet been discovered, this seems to be the only way in which independent directors can be appointed. Now, you can say that the controlling shareholder should not be allowed to vote when an independent director election is on. But somebody has to put it in the notice of the AGM. So if you take away the controlling shareholder's right, even in the board, to object to the notice, there's that. And indeed, the Companies Act provides for a nominee director of the small shareholders, minority shareholders. I don't think there's any company in India which has yet appointed a minority shareholder director. Not one out of those 6,000 where Burzin said. Yeah, not one. They have the choice because they can't get together. How will these minorities coalesce into a group which can then come up with this idea? There is no device or no mechanism for such a coalition to be created. Okay, any other?
Since there are a lot of internal auditors here, I ask how much time do the audit committee really have for internal audit? And do they also own the internal audit relationship or only the statutory audit relationship?
Yeah, I think they should also own the internal audit relationship, but that is a more sensitive thing because the primary customer of the internal auditor is the management. It's not the audit committee. The audit committee is only concerned about now that all this internal financial controls, which have been defined as even efficiencies and so on. So really all internal controls. Uh, and because the board of directors makes a public statement every year in the annual report saying the internal controls are adequate and they are effective. So the audit committee is concerned if that is not adequately addressed. And if there is some fraud or gotala, obviously the audit committee would want to know. So they should own the relationship, but it's a bit of a joint ownership. So they should always involve management and indeed leave most of the stuff to the management here to decide what should be audited, unless they feel that that should be different. So that's the first. Sorry, you had two parts to your question.
How much time
Time.
do the auditors
Every committee. I've heard of committees which don't give more than 15 minutes to the internal auditor because they meet only 4 times a year. And so, inevitably, the audit committee meeting is between 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock, and 2 o'clock the board convenes. So they don't have time because they've got related party transactions, the quarterly financial statements, everything. So some lift service is paid. And so the internal auditor is told, be as brief as you can. Can you summarize your whole presentation in just 1 page and just, the 6 or 7 key points, take 1 minute each and we are happy. Don't bother us with too much. And there are audit committees which have a full day session 2 or 3 times a year only to deal with the internal audit reports. So it just depends. But I'm not in favor of the first type. Yeah. Everything can be improved. My wife is always trying to improve me even after 42 years. So if after 42 years I can be improved, why not the audit committee?
Sir, not in that sense.
Yeah.
Statutorily,
Of course it
because
can
what
be
you
improved.
mentioned,
Yeah.
even I have heard the same thing that you mentioned 15 minutes. I have been told by my friends it is only 5 minutes.
Well, there you are then.
They only ask whether there is anything of significance which you want to tell us.
Yeah, correct. It may be.
So they are just dismissed and whole
It
day
may be.
goes.
I agree. Now what can I say?
So it means the entire structuring of internal audit, audit committee needs to be improved.
See, now SEBI will come out with a circular saying audit committees must spend at least 2 hours discussing internal audit. So in the minutes it will be written, starting time, ending time. All these things you can't regulate this. It depends on the individuals. And if the individuals are committed to good governance, you will get it. If they are not committed, there are 1,000 ways not to do it.
Mr. Mirza, can you throw some light on how the self-assessment for the boards are being done? And
well,
from your experience.
Good in parts. Some companies do it more rigorously, some don't. And India is the only country in the world. Again, there's another unique thing in India. We're the only country in the world where individual directors are mandatorily to be assessed. There are many countries require assessment of board performance as a body, not of individuals. And there are many reasons why they have not gone down that road. In India, I think because the people sitting in Shastri Bhavan in Delhi have, some vague idea about what happens. So they also mandated this individual assessment. These things don't really work. And the companies that do it well, what they do is, I'll give you my own experience because I've headed NRCs for many years. And what I say is I circulate to every director, not circulate, I ask every director to comment on his peers and answer 3 questions. First is, what does that colleague director do well? Second, what can they do better? They do it okay, but can they do better? And last, what should they stop doing? Just 3 questions. And on stop doing, you will get things like he talks too much. It's true, very common. Or he doesn't talk enough. Or she, not only men we should blame. Yeah, let everyone share in this credit. So there are only 3 questions, and then you assimilate this as the chairman of the NRC, and privately you convey to each director that look, lots of people think you shouldn't talk so much, or whatever, or you should bring more of your particular expertise, that you don't seem to be contributing that in the board because we know you are an expert on this topic, but you're sort of reticent. Why are you reticent? Please speak, because everyone wants you to speak. So why are you then holding back? So that's how. But that's the good boards. I think the majority of them, the whole attitude is sab theek hai, and you don't minute all this stuff. You say that this is the process followed, and each director was individually conveyed their pluses and minuses. But in many boards, I'm afraid this is given a go by, and it's sort of expected that you'll just say, is there any particular thing against the director? Nothing, ne? So we'll minute it. Oh, all is okay.
Mr. Mirza, you mentioned about that Maxis deal where the IDBI, CBI is probing, and I have been told that the CBI, which they have filed the FIR, they have named the three independent directors also, and they've been asked for questioning. They've been called. So, do you feel with this, independent directors will come on board of companies? Is it not giving a negative signals? Because was the chartered accountant who is on the board or the independent director should look at the small deals of even giving a loan?
Okay, let me make two observations. It's again a very good question, I think. Narayan. My first observation is there are thousands of companies which should not have gone to the public capital markets. And the fact that they could get individuals to become independent directors enabled their being able to take money from gullible investors. And I think the independent directors were complicit in the, as it were, I speak strongly, were complicit in the fraud played upon the small investors by joining the boards of those companies. If such companies or such promoters couldn't find a single independent director at all, they would never have been able to list. So all those who are eager to become independent directors, regardless of the reputation of the promoter, have been complicit in whatever was done to harm the other stakeholders. So that is my first observation. My other one is that you said, will it deter? But if I ask my driver to become an independent director, what does he understand? He will agree. Now you can't legislate these things. You can say drivers can't be independent directors. Then what else? How many things can you not do? The fact of the matter is, people will find a way around. And I've said to the SEBI chairman who berates auditors and independent directors, I say, sir, the problem is with you. You should never have admitted this kind of organization into the capital markets. Why did you admit such a promoter to take money from the public markets? It's your fault before you start blaming everyone else. Look at your own role in this. To which, of course, there was no satisfactory response.
Any other questions?
So, who has been your inspiration to all that you do? Because surely you must have a mentor or somebody who, because we look up to you. Who do you look up to?
Now, don't put me on a pedestal. I'll fall hard. No, I'm just an ordinary person. But I think there was one individual I would like to pay tribute to today, since you asked me this question. And he used to be a president of our institute, a man called Pesi Narelwala, who was for many years my partner, and of course much senior to me, but he was also, it just so happens, my cousin. And I many years lived with him in his house before I got married. So he, by his own conduct and behavior, he maybe to some extent influenced me. But I'm afraid in later life he also succumbed to some of the very weaknesses we have, and he became chairman of a board, which ultimately the promoter has gone away to London, and I think it's been 20 years since he's been there and not come back, because they'll arrest him if he comes back. Now quite innocently got entrapped in this whole thing. So even the best people can stumble. But I think if you ask me who inspired, but I think I'm just hard, half mad fellow. So 90% mad. Yeah. Okay. Always going in this thing. Yeah. Okay. Khatam.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mirza. And that means that two qualities what he has narrated for independent director, which can get help the board, would be attitude and commitment. I think that is in nutshell. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ah, of course. Yeah, yeah. Depends upon whether it's rum or if it's the work is harder, it can be whiskey also. Before I request Preeti to propose a vote of thanks, I will. We have at BCA we give a photograph of this session to the speaker. This is called instant photograph. So he can go and show to his wife that he had really gone to this session. You know.
My wife is right now in Kunur.
Ha ha ha. So you can. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I will request Gurzin to do the honors.
Thank you very much. It's really quite remarkable. I didn't know you did that. A photograph of a photograph.
And we also hand over a thank you note.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Preeti. Don't worry about what is said that one sentence. Go ahead with your what you have prepared here.
I have the courage. Good evening once again. And, when Narayan Bhai suggested that I should do the vote of thanks, I said, let me look up the name. What does the name Nawshir mean? And the dictionary tells me it means charismatic. I think all of us would agree that he has indeed been a very charismatic speaker. He's inspired all of us here. And Mr. Mirza, while you told me to just complete my vote of thanks in one sentence, please realize that I am putting punctuation marks, so it's all one sentence. It's not, the full stop is yet to come in. Okay? So it's one thing to read about the code for independent directors, and I would like to believe, sir, that when the lawmakers put it down, they must have looked at you and said, let's put down what Mr. Mirza represents. Uh, so, on behalf of the BCS, on behalf of the IIA Bombay chapter, thank you very much for coming here, for cutting short your holiday with your wife. Many apologies to her. We do hope we'll be able to host her for one evening. And thank you. Thanks a lot. Your presence has been most valuable. Thank you.